A conversation with John Turner, leader of the Liberal Party of Canada. Here is Bayton National Editor Tom Clark.
Good evening. Well, what a difference a debate makes. After spending the first month of this campaign in what many felt was a fatal decline, John Turner stood it on its head. If the polls are to be believed, Canadians, by a wide margin, awarded the debating prize to the Liberal leader. And that sparked a massive reversal in voter preference. The Liberals have now skyrocketed from third place to first place. And the previous conventional wisdom, which saw a return to power for the Conservatives, has been quite simply thrown out of the window. At the very least, this campaign is very much up for grabs, and the momentum is very much in the Liberal camp. A conversation with John Turner in just 1 minute. So, we got... Well, Mr. Turner, good evening and welcome. It has been, by any measure, an extraordinary past couple of weeks for you. Everything has turned around. Now, there are 1,000 people out there with a million explanations as to what happened, but I'd like to know what your explanation is. What has happened in the past week and a half in this country?
Well, Mr. Clark, I always felt that if I could get an opportunity to talk to Canadians face-to-face, without any interpreters or any intermediaries, and tell them how I felt about Canada, why I was against that trade deal with the United States, what was really on my mind, that if I could do that, I'd have a good chance of persuading Canadians that I was on the right track for Canada.
Well, let's go to the free trade thing, because that is the preeminent issue in the campaign, and all the polls have shown, incidentally, that you have now captured that as your own issue, the anti-free trade side on that. You've eclipsed the NDP in terms of taking that issue. But earlier this week, when the polls started showing you on top, and by a wide margin, the Canadian dollar started to plunge, its biggest plunge in years. The international business community seemed to be saying, with one voice and very loudly, that they didn't really like the idea of an anti-free trade government or a government structure that would block the free trade deal.
Well, I think during every election that I can remember, there's always some uncertainty. You know, people are used to a certain government and then wonder what the next government is going to do. So that doesn't bother me. I think the dollar is stabilized, and all I can say to Canadians is this, that if I get the opportunity of forming a government, it will be a prudent government, it'll be sane, it will deal with our finances in a very responsible way, the way I feel I dealt with our finances when I was Minister of Finance for 4 years. So that I would say to Canadians, the most important thing is the future of our country, the crusade I'm leading for Canada. Not an anti-American campaign in any way, but a pro-Canadian campaign. Campaign saying, yes, we respect our American neighbors. We want to trade more widely with our American neighbors, but that the deal Mr. Mulroney signed is bad for Canada in that it sells us out.
Let's explore this whole free trade thing a little bit. Let's assume for a minute that on November 22nd you wake up and you're Prime Minister of this country. Are you saying that free trade is finished and gone, or are you saying that you try and renegotiate another free trade deal?
Well, I've always believed that Canada has done better negotiating with the United States under an international umbrella. For 45 years since the war, we've done that under the auspices of the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade in Geneva. We've done that because we've always been suspicious of a head-to-head negotiation with the United States, which is a country 10 times stronger than we are, 10 times more populous, 10 times the economy. We've always felt that if you go head-to-head in those kinds of circumstances, you're going to have to give 10 times the concessions. And that's what Mr. Mulroney was forced to give. So that Canada has been international in our dealings with the United States, just as we've been international in our defense treaties with the United States. We've been involved, as one of the founders of NATO, with our European and American partners. We've always hedged our bets, if they. Very friendly with the Americans, accepting American leadership as the head of the Alliance of the West, but conscious of our own way of doing things, conscious of our own way of looking at things. Now, if on November 22nd I have the responsibility of government, of course, I'll go down to Washington and talk to the new president and say, look, you understand democracy. You've just gone through a very tough election yourself. You know that this is a far more important deal to Canada than it is to you. It's everything for us. We're a smaller economy. Canadians turned it down in a very democratic way. And I'd say to American business, Canadians, the shareholders, refused to ratify the deal. Now, where do we go? Well, I'd say to the United States, let's continue to pursue together what we've always done before very successfully. Let's enlarge the jurisdiction of the General Trading Organization, the GATT. Let's widen its ambit. Let's strengthen its dispute mechanism. And in that way, you and us, you and we, can continue to lower trade barriers between us as we have done successfully before, but not in a way that surrenders what we Canadians believe is very important: our energy policy, our capital markets, our investment strategy, our agriculture. And I just say, Mr. President, Canadians have come to the conclusion that my predecessor, Mr. Mulroney, got taken by your predecessor, President Reagan. And we want to start again fresh, but on a way that's been very successful for us both over the years.
Well, you'd have to say that he was also taken by the Senate and the House of Representatives, because they voted for this overwhelmingly.
Well,
and they're democratically controlled.
I am not surprised that the United States Senate took about a day to pass this agreement. And the House of Representatives took about a day, too. I mean, it was a sweetheart for them. I mean, the Americans couldn't believe their good luck in this deal. And it fulfilled what President Reagan called the American dream. Well, I think Canadians admire Americans. We like Americans. We want to continue to do business with Americans. We want their leadership in defense, but we don't want to become Americans. And I think that's what Canadians are beginning to say.
Okay, but if on November 22nd we have a minority government, is that really a clear statement by Canadians about how they feel about free trade? Would you accept a minority government situation of whatever stripe as saying that's it for free trade, or would you say that's a split decision and we got to go back to the people in some form or another to get a real decision here?
Well, I think we have every good chance at the moment of forming a majority government. But taking your question, if there is a majority of members of Parliament returned by the Canadian people into the next House of Commons, a majority of members of Parliament who are against the trade deal, then I will consider the trade deal to have been defeated by a free vote of Canadians. And I think the next Parliament will have to take that into account.
You wouldn't consider a referendum on the issue?
I don't believe in referendums. I believe that there are very few issues that are simple enough for a simple yes or no answer. And I think Mr. Mulroney is campaigning on the trade agreement. He says it's central to his campaign. He said at the beginning of the election it was the centerpiece of his campaign. Now, mind you, under a little pressure in the debate, he said it was just another commercial contract that could be annulled on 6 months' notice. But no, he's carrying this agreement as the centerpiece of his campaign. I'm saying to Canadians, I believe it's bad for Canada. I believe it's a weak deal. I believe that there are better ways of enlarging our trading opportunities with the United States and around the world. And that's the issue now before the country. And I think Canadians now see the pros and cons. They're now making up their minds. And we have responsible government. Governments take responsibility for programs and for issues. Oppositions take responsibility for the issues they're presenting to the people. Let Canadians decide.
Okay. You know, this campaign, in some respects, over the last few days, has turned nasty for the first time. You have been called a liar by the Prime Minister, by the Finance Minister, and others in the Tory party. They're saying you're lying about the deal. You and Ed Broadbent are lying about the deal. Let's pick one area. You say that free trade allows the Americans a say in our Medicare system. Now, what I'm wondering is, could you refer us to the exact clause in the deal that gives the Americans a say in our Medicare system, or gives them the right to tell us that we have to phase it out? Can you just give us that reference?
Article 1906, Article 1907, set up a 5 to 7 year period of negotiation on the definition of subsidy, a common definition of subsidy, because the two countries couldn't agree, and I can understand why. Under the American definition of subsidy, under the 1930 Trade Act of the United States, the 1974 Trade Act, and particularly the current omnibus bill that was just signed by the President of the United States. Those statutes, American statutes, have definitions of subsidies wide enough to affect any advantage by way of a public program or a regional equality program or a social program or an agricultural program or any tax or grant advantage or subsidy advantage to any Canadian business as against an American that this country grants. And because of that, and because of the official interpretation placed on the American legislation that implemented the agreement by the President of the United States, where he says that it is the objective of American policy to eliminate any advantage to Canadian industry by way of subsidy not enjoyed by an American counterpart on our territory, then it's quite clear that all our programs are negotiable. And I asked the Prime Minister on television, why didn't you get a specific exemption for our social programs, including Medicare? Why didn't you get a specific exemption for our regional equality development programs or for our agricultural programs the way you got for culture? Mind you, I'm not so sure that that's enforceable the way it's drafted. And he never gave me an answer. And when I pressed him on national television, he fell back and he said, well, what are you worried about? It's only another commercial contract with a 6-month cancellation clause. Well, that's not the way you deal with a nation. Because if this deal were to go through, hundreds of thousands of Canadian jobs would be dislocated, hundreds of millions of Canadian dollars and American dollars would be invested. You know, you can't play games with the future of the country. So my answer to Mr. Wilson and to Mr. Mulroney is this. The American definition of subsidy is wide enough to embrace all the programs we've been talking about. Why didn't you make it clear and get an exemption for our social programs and our regional equality programs?
But that area is up for negotiation, which presumably means that both sides come to the table and negotiate from their previous fixed positions. I guess what I'm trying to drive at here, and I suppose part of the confusion of Canadians, is that they hear about this definition of subsidies and how it may apply to all these programs. I think a lot of Canadians are trying to figure out, does the deal actually say that we got to get rid of Medicare? Does the deal say we've actually got to get rid of our other social programs?
Well,
or is it a question of negotiation?
You know, when the Prime Minister announced that he was going to have bilateral negotiations with the United States, I said to him, why break from a winning tradition? We now have 80% free trade with the United States right now, across that border, goods crossing the border, because of our international negotiations. Why go head-to-head with the strongest country in the world? Well, he said to me, I'm worried about protectionist sentiment in the United States Congress. I want to get secure access for Canadian exports. I said, well, you'll only get that, Mr. Prime Minister, if you get a specific exemption from American protectionist trade law. Now, you didn't get it. He didn't get it. And what's happened is that if you go head-to-head, anybody who's made any deal at all, if the other fellow's got 10 times your market, as the United States has, 10 times your population, 10 times your economy, in order to get any penetration into his backyard, into his market, you have to give away 10 times the concessions. And that's what the Prime Minister did. He gave away our investment policy, our ability to control Canadian ownership of our business in this country, our energy policy. We've become a reservoir, a continental reservoir for the United States. Our capital markets, our banks are now open for takeover, and so on. Our supply management and agriculture. He's already given away. I mean, our economy, all the economic levers we have, well beyond trade. So my question is quite fundamental. We, in bargaining on the definition of subsidy, already into the American orbit because of this trade deal, what chance have we got when the Americans start putting this overwhelming pressure on us head-to-head on their definition as against our definition? And I think it's inevitable that Canadian business will say, on the one hand, look, our American competitors are now head-to-head with us. They don't have the strict environmental legislation that we have. It's an extra cost to us. Hey, cut down environmental stuff. We can't compete.
Well, now, excuse me, but Pollution Probe says that that's not the case, that the American standards in many cases are higher than the Canadian standards, and they've come out in favor, strangely enough, of the idea of free trade because that'll help the environmental.
Well, you know, no fewer than 90 independent environmental organizations in Canada, voluntary associations, one coast to the other, met on September 22nd, analyzed the deal as I've analyzed the deal, and said, this makes it more difficult for Canada to erect within industry and within our governmental programs an attack on pollution. A, because Canadian business will say, we're competing with companies that have less stringent standards, or American business will say to us, hey, look, that tax incentive to the nickel company or to the pulp and paper company, that grant, that regional grant, is an unfair trading advantage under our definition of subsidy, and it's against the spirit of the agreement. Both sides are going to be pressuring to normalize, or the word in the agreement is harmonize, and that is defined in the agreement as render identical our environmental programs. The same pressures will be on our unemployment insurance. Only a quarter of American workers are covered. On minimum wage, many of the states have no minimum wage. On every program, our agricultural programs, every one of them supporting the grain economy in Western Canada is listed in the annex. Our seasonal protection for fruit and vegetables, gone. Our marketing boards won't be able to function if our food processors here in Canada are able now, free of duty, to purchase Californian and Floridan and Georgian fruits and vegetables on a 12-month season against our shorter season. I'm telling you, when a country does voluntarily what Mr. Mulrooney did to us, surrender the economic levers that have built a nation and our special way of life in terms of our fairness, in terms of our social programs, our fairness in terms of equalizing opportunities across Canada, when those economic levers are surrendered, the political levers are not far behind.
Let me just repeat to you what a number of business people, and especially some of the people in the banks, are beginning to say this week. They're saying that if there's no free trade, the dollar plunges. One person was saying interest rates, possibly 20%. Another economist is, with one of the big brokerage houses on Bay Street, is saying that we may be heading into a recession as a result of this. How do you buy all that stuff?
You know, I've asked the bankers and trust company people and insurance companies. I said, how can you fellas? Because, you know, I want to unify this country, and I want to persuade business and labor, consumers, in what I'm doing. But I've asked these financial institutions, how can you buy this deal when the Americans can now come up and operate American subsidiaries with the same advantages that our Canadian chartered banks have? No more restrictions. Technically, our banks can now be bought by Americans, insurance companies, investment brokers, trust companies, and yet you don't get reciprocal rights into the American market. First of all, because banks are certified and registered at the state level, and a number of the leading states have restrictions against foreign banking, including Canadian banking, and because of the statutes of the Congress, you can't buy an investment brokerage in the United States because no bank can. You've got taken to the cleaners in the financial markets. How can you possibly support the deal? And I haven't got too many satisfactory answers.
You don't think they're right when they're talking about 20% inflation and 20% interest rates, rather, and a recession?
Well, look, you know, Mr. Mulrooney can't boast about the strong economy that Canada has had in the last 2 or 3 years, particularly in Ontario. It hasn't been widely shared, but he can't talk about that on the one hand, where we have no free trade at all, and then say if this deal doesn't go through, we've got Armageddon ahead of us. You know, I think that Canadians will want to make the right decision about our country, and the markets will respect that decision.
Let's just leave free trade for a minute. I want to ask you about a statement that you made concerning acid rain. You've said that you would negotiate a very tough agreement with the United States on the question of acid rain. The previous government tried for 4 years to negotiate a very, very mild agreement on acid rain and failed utterly at all 3 levels of the American administration. What makes you think that you could go down to Washington and get a tough deal with the United States, especially after you've killed free trade?
Well, to begin with, I think Mr. Mulrooney subordinated the acid rain and environmental question to getting his trade deal with the United States. He didn't want anything to rock the boat. He'd already thrown away our Foreign Investment Review Act. He threw away our National Energy Program. He allowed the American pharmaceutical companies to come in and dictate how our legislation would be. He watered down our broadcasting legislation, you know, because of the lobby in the United States and so on. He allowed President Reagan at 4 successive annual summit meetings to escape with a promise every year of more research on acid rain. Well, nobody needs any more research. We know that those SO2 emissions and NO2 emissions are what are killing our rivers and our lakes and our maple trees. And by the way, lakes and rivers and maple trees on the American side of the border as well. So he subordinated the environmental priority to getting his trade deal at any cost. Now, I'd go down and talk to the next president, and I'd say, look, let's not confuse the issues here. We want to continue to negotiate with you internationally on trade, and there are ways we can work together. But this environmental issue is something different. This affects both of us. Now, the most successful international treaty that was ever signed was the 1904 Boundary Waters Treaty between Canada and the United States. We set up an international joint commission which administers jointly our Great Lakes and our international river system, and is starting to clean those lakes up, clean those waters up. We're making some progress. Let's get that international joint commission, give it a mandate for a year to come up with the basis of a clean air treaty between Canada and the United States, to clean up our air as we've begun to clean up our international waters. I think that that would meet with a very solid response from an environmentally conscious president. I have a feeling...
George Bush?
Well, I think Bush is far more sensitive to it than President Reagan was, and certainly Governor Dukakis is. But I'd go farther than that. Prime Minister Mulrooney dealt only with President Reagan. He didn't understand the separation of powers, that you've got to deal with the leading senators on both sides of the aisle, you've got to deal with the leading congressmen, you've got to deal with the governors of the industrial states, Ohio, Pennsylvania, Michigan, and so on, where a lot of these emissions are coming from. And more than that, you go down as neighbors and you say to the American people, we have a mutual problem to solve. Let's do it together. Now, I happen to feel that Americans are very reasonable people, and that's the style of campaign I'd wage.
Okay, there's so many more things I want to talk to you about, but we're running out of time, and I can't. We've got to get back into the political arena for a minute. You know, with the way the numbers have been going for you in the past couple of weeks, a lot of people have almost forgotten your leadership problems of just a few weeks ago and what was going on with inside your party. But let's very quickly sketch out what happens after November 22nd. No clear government in Ottawa. Would you form a coalition with the NDP to stop free trade? Or would you give up the chance of governing by not forming a coalition?
Well, we're counting on a majority government. But I wouldn't contemplate a coalition in the sense of sharing cabinet posts with the NDP or anybody else. We'd accept the parliament as we found it, but we would deal with the issues as they arose. Undoubtedly, if Mr. Mulroney fails to get a majority, and I believe he will, because I'm confident that Canadians are coming to the view that this trade deal is bad for Canada. If he fails to get that, then the trade issue will be fatal for him. Then we'll have to deal with the situation as we find it. But I don't think I'm any different from most Canadians. That I believe in the style of country we have, our own way of doing things, our own psychology, our own sense of humor, our frontier in the north, feeling we have for our geography and for the outdoors. We are different. And I believe that Canadians will respond to my crusade for Canada. We are something special. We're something unique. Let's build on that. Let's not throw it away.
What happened? I want to bring you back to politics, and we've only got 1 minute left.
Okay.
Would you stick around as Liberal leader if you did not form the next government on November 22nd?
I am convinced that I will form the next government. This opposition to this trade deal has been, as a Canadian, the cause of my life. I feel very honored in leading a crusade for Canada. I'm going to see the thing through. And I believe that Canadians are beginning to share my vision of the country.
Just before we go, how's your back?
Little pinched nerve. Not too bad. Hasn't affected the brain yet.
Yet.
It hasn't affected my ability to communicate, and I felt pretty good in being able to stand up for 3 hours and 2 nights in a row.
Mr. Turner, good of you to drop by. Best of luck to you for the
Thank
rest
you.
of the campaign.
Thank you, Mr. Clark.
Thank you, Mr. Clark. Good night.
This has been a conversation with John Turner, leader of the Liberal Party of Canada. Next week at this time, a conversation with Prime Minister Brian Mulroney, leader of the Progressive Conservative Party of Canada.